A final and executory judgment is the legal bedrock of certainty. Once appeals are exhausted, the decision is absolute, until it is shattered. This is the central outcome of the Supreme Court case Cojuanco-Suntay v. Suntay. The foundational timeline begins with the finality of Cojuanco-Suntay's probate decision in January 2002. The aggrieved petitioners only discovered the existence of the second will in December 2002. They filed the annulment in November 2006. Under Section 3 of Rule 47, the 4-year clock for extrinsic fraud begins at the moment of discovery, not the date of the original judgment. The Court of Appeals initially dismissed the petition, citing laches or unreasonable delay for waiting nearly 4 years to file. The Supreme Court reversed this, noting that the petitioners were actively pursuing related litigation in another court, which precludes the concept of laches. This follows the equitable principle that delay caused directly by an opponent's fraudulent concealment cannot be used against the victim. Mastering the discovery trigger is the first requirement to pass the Rule 47 procedural gateway. Once past the gateway, the burden shifts to proving extrinsic fraud. This involves acts occurring outside the trial that prevent a party from having their day in court. In this case, Cojuanco-Suntay used a 3-part strategy to deliberately conceal the proceedings from his heirs. First, regarding venue, Cojuanco was an actual resident of Baguio City. However, he chose to file the probate petition in the neighboring municipality of La Trinidad. Moving the filing away from his residence provided the foundational step in hiding the proceedings from his family. Second, Cojuanco actively omitted the petitioner's addresses from the second probate petition. Omitting the addresses of known heirs is a fatal violation of Section 2, Rule 76. Finally, he failed to effect service of the first and second notices of hearing. The coordination of these procedural gaps created a calculated scheme of concealment, meeting the Supreme Court's threshold for extrinsic fraud. When confronted with these omissions, defendants often argue that newspaper publication is sufficient because probate is an in rem proceeding. While publication binds the world generally, it does not supplant specific statutory rules regarding known heirs. Rule 76, Section 4, states that the court shall cause copies of the notice to be addressed to the designated heirs. The word shall imposes a mandatory, non-negotiable obligation to provide personal notice to known heirs and legatees. The law treats the absence of this notice as a fatal denial of constitutional due process. This violation renders the entire probate structure void from inception. The final battleground centers on how a party definitively proves that service by registered mail occurred. The Court of Appeals incorrectly relied on registry return receipts alone to invoke the presumption of regularity, but the Supreme Court enforces a stricter standard. Under Rule 13, Section 13, there is a dual requirement: the registry receipt and a sworn affidavit detailing the date, place, and manner of service. Without this specific affidavit, the presumption of regularity is destroyed, and service is legally non-existent. Physical evidence further undermined the claim of regular service. The envelopes bore a care of Cojuanco address block and a return to sender, unknown, postal stamp. Mailing notices to a care of address controlled by the opposing party rebuts any claim of proper delivery. The presumption of regularity cannot cure fatal evidentiary defects if the strict checklist for service is incomplete. We have now mapped the 3 essential elements required to dismantle a finalized judgment: the discovery timeline, the fraud matrix, and the dual-proof service checklist. The core jurisprudential lesson of Cojuanco-Suntay is that the Supreme Court will not allow the doctrine of finality to shield deliberate procedural concealment. Even a decade later, the law protects heir rights against manipulated venues and omitted addresses. Practitioners must never rely on generalized presumptions or postal receipts alone to prove service. Strict adherence to the affidavit requirements of Rule 13 and the mandatory notice provisions of Rule 76 is the only protection against the extraordinary reach of Rule 47.